What if the real war inside every human is not between good and evil, but between the wild and the tame? Tonight we begin a journey through level 1 to 100 of philosophy that questions human nature, but not in the way it's usually taught, not with cold definitions and neat categories. No, this story is different. This is the shadowy side of philosophy, the one that whispers behind closed doors and stirs quietly in the dark. The side that asks, what are humans, really, when no one is watching? If that question speaks to something ancient in the back of your mind, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. We post every single day, and every night there's a new story waiting for you. Also, let us know in the comments, what time is it where you are right now, and where in the world are you listening from? It always fascinates us to see the strange clockwork of minds that gather here each night. Now, Ahen, breathe slow. Let the air fall quiet and listen. Thomas Hobbes once said that the natural state of man is war. Not war with tanks or gunfire, but a deeper, quieter kind. A state of all against all. He imagined humans as hungry, anxious animals, each one afraid of the other. Each one armed with reason, but moved by fear. Without society, without law, without rules, Hobbes believed life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He wasn't trying to be poetic. He was warning us. Strip away the illusions of civility, he said, and what's left is the beast. But not everyone agreed. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, writing nearly a century later, painted a gentler picture. To him, humans in their natural state were peaceful, free, innocent. He believed it was society, its inequalities, its hierarchies, its artificial needs, that had corrupted the human soul. Man is born free, Rousseau said, but everywhere he is in chains. And so the split began, a war of ideas as old as fire. Is man dangerous by nature, or only made so by nurture? This question doesn't live in books, it lives in the street, in the way strangers glare at each other in traffic, in the way a child learns to lie, in the way leaders rise by dividing. Sigmund Freud took a darker route. He looked inward and saw a war within, between the primitive id and the civilized superego, between instinct and repression. The id wants food, sex, power, safety. The superego wants order, control, approval, and stuck in the middle, the ego tries to survive. Freud believed that civilization itself was built on a trade. In exchange for peace, humans suppress their urges. They build cities instead of killing each other. They form families instead of giving in to lust. But the instincts don't disappear. They go underground, and sometimes they leak, in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in war, in cruelty. Freud called this the return of the repressed. What we bury always finds a way back. Nietzsche, ever the disruptor, agreed with Freud in part, but went further. To him, the very idea of morality was a tool used by the weak to shame the strong. He saw the origins of good and evil not as universal truths, but as psychological tactics. The noble once defined good as power, strength, vitality, but over time the weak, unable to compete, redefined good as humility, obedience, meekness. Nietzsche called this the slave revolt in morals, a quiet rebellion, the beginning of guilt, and perhaps the beginning of self-deception. He asked a chilling question: what if what we call good is just what's convenient to power? Evolutionary psychology would later echo some of these themes. It suggested that many of our behaviours, jealousy, tribalism, competition, gossip, aren't cultural at all. They're ancient adaptations, shaped not by choice, but by survival. In the ancestral world, being wary of outsiders increased your odds of survival. Being jealous helped guard reproductive success. Being a gossip kept track of who could be trusted. These aren't sins, they're strategies, hidden programs running beneath the surface. And yet, they don't always serve us now. That's the paradox. Traits that once helped us thrive now fuel everything from anxiety to hatred. It's not that we're bad, It's that we're outdated, running ancient software in a modern world. So what is human nature, really? Is it the fearful wolf of Hobbes baring teeth at the night? Is it the innocent wanderer of Rousseau, corrupted only by the city lights? Is it the divided soul of Freud, forever at war with itself? Or is it Nietzsche's cunning ape, dressing instinct in the robes of virtue? Maybe the truth is quieter than all of them. Maybe it's not one thing at all. Maybe we are 100 selves layered into one. Ancient code written in blood and fear and fire. Civilization didn't erase it, it just taught it how to smile. Think of it this way. If a human is placed in the woods with no laws, no cameras, no judgments, what version of them emerges? That answer depends on what they believe survival demands. And that's the haunting part. Because survival doesn't always mean food or safety. It can mean status, approval, ego. Sometimes people betray others not to live, but to feel important. That's human too, not evil, just human. Power pulls like gravity, fear whispers like wind, and under the right pressure, almost anyone can become almost anything. That's not cynicism, that's humility. To know what humans are, one must first admit what they can become. In prison, in war, in love, in loneliness, in hunger. There is no single truth about human nature, only a pattern, a shadow, a possibility, and tonight that's where we begin. Quietly, curiously, without judgment. Just a candle, a question, and the soft rustle of thought. Let's keep going. They say a human is born unfinished, no claws, no fur, no instincts to build a den or migrate with the seasons. Just a naked, blinking creature, soft and slow, placed into a world far older and harsher than itself. That helplessness is often seen as weakness, but it's also a strange power, because the unfinished can be shaped, and from that blankness comes something unsettling. Humans must invent themselves. No script, no instruction manual, just imitation, reflection, and memory. That is where the roots of human nature grow, not from certainty, but from mimicry. Freud knew this. He believed every person carries within them a haunted theatre of the past, where the roles of mother, father, love, shame, and fear are played out again and again in disguise. Childhood isn't left behind, it becomes the cast. And all through life, people are pulled toward reenactments they don't understand. The one who is ignored seeks admiration. The one who is controlled chases chaos. The one who is hurt sometimes learns to hurt. Is this evil? Number. Its echo. Soft, sad, and mostly invisible. Carl Jung saw this echo too, but gave it a deeper twist. To him, each person wears a mask, what he called the persona, the version shown to the world. Polite, controlled, edited, but beneath it lives the shadow. The impulses that aren't allowed. The rage, the lust, the envy. The hunger to dominate, to destroy, to take. Not because people are wicked, but because they are whole. And wholeness includes what culture tells us to hide. The danger is not in having a shadow. The danger is in denying it, because what is denied becomes distorted. Suppressed wolves don't disappear. They find new shapes: passive aggression, moral superiority, online cruelty dressed as virtue. The modern world is full of shadows that think they are saints. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." So perhaps human nature is not evil nor good, but unexamined. And the less it's examined, the more it controls. But the story doesn't end with the self. No human exists alone. Each one is born into a tribe, a family, a flag, a story not chosen but inherited. And this too shapes nature, not the genes, the games humans play to belong, to rise, to matter. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt calls humans 90% chimp, 10% bee, selfish enough to protect their own, but wired for a kind of hive mind too, capable of dying for a flag, a god, a team. Sometimes people think the mind is private, but it isn't. Beliefs are contagious, moods spread, ideas replicate like viruses. Evolution didn't stop at biology, it continued through culture. And some of the traits that survive best are the ones that trick people into protecting them. Think of the idea of honor, or patriotism, or tradition. These aren't truths, they are codes. They bind people, they justify sacrifice. And once embedded, they're hard to question. Because questioning them makes someone an outsider. And to be outside the tribe is to risk death, not today, but once long ago. That fear still lingers. Evolutionary psychologists explain this with group selection. The tribe that sticks together survives. So the human mind evolved to conform, to judge, to punish defectors. Not because it's logical, because it worked, and it still works. This is why moral outrage feels good, why gossip is irresistible, why someone who questions too much becomes a threat. Not a thinker, a traitor. What's disturbing is how easily this machinery turns ugly. How quickly kindness becomes cruelty when the tribe is at stake. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments showed that ordinary people would deliver what they believed were deadly electric shocks to strangers, simply because an authority told them to. Not monsters, not criminals, just neighbours, secretaries, dads. They winced. They asked questions, but most complied. Why? Because defying the group feels worse than harming the other. This is the underbelly of human social nature. Humans want to be good, yes, but only within the rules of their tribe. Change the rules, and goodness follows. Eichmann thought he was just doing his job. The people burning witches believed they were saving souls. No one sees themselves as the villain. Even cruelty wears a reason. And that's what makes it so dangerous. The philosopher Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil. The idea that atrocities are not committed by monsters, but by bureaucrats, by quiet, obedient men following orders, filing papers, scheduling trains. Evil, she said, is not always demonic. Sometimes it's boring, efficient, polite. This should terrify. Because it means human nature isn't just about feelings, it's about roles. Put a kind person in a cruel system, and they adapt, they justify, they become. Is that weakness or is that design? No one knows, but the evidence is everywhere. Look at Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. Volunteers assigned the role of guard began to humiliate and abuse fellow students within days. No script, no orders, just uniforms, just power, just the shadow given permission. This is the heart of it. Humans are not stable, they are role-based, and roles are shaped by story, by culture, by context. That's why the same man can be a hero in one country and a criminal in another. Why revolutions are noble when they win and treason when they fail. Why a father at home becomes a predator at war. The mask changes, the creature adapts, but underneath it all, the ancient brain remains, still wired to fear, still quick to sort us from them, still hungry to matter. This is not hopeless, but it is sobering. It means that what people call human nature is really just the settings of the current game. Change the incentives, the story, the masks, and the nature shifts. Not easily, but predictably. And this is why philosophy matters. Not to escape human nature, but to see it, to name it, to make it visible before it becomes violent. The Stoics knew this. They said, don't trust feelings, don't chase power, don't get pulled by praise or panic. Practice reason, practice stillness, practice death. That sounds grim, but it isn't. It's armor. It's a way to keep the beast from wearing the crown. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire, but wrote only about virtue. Epictetus was born a slave, but spoke like a king. Neither believed humans were naturally good or bad. They believed humans were moldable, and the molding was the responsibility. So what, then, is the conclusion? That humans are nothing? That everything is influence? Number? The opposite. It means humans are potential. That's the horror and the hope. The unfinished can still be shaped. The script can be edited. The shadow can be met with honesty, but only if seen, only if spoken, only if the firelight is steady enough to hold the gaze. Most people don't want to look, not because they're afraid of monsters, but because they suspect the monster might speak with their voice. But if the monster speaks in a familiar voice, what does that say about the voice itself? About the face seen in the mirror when no one else is watching? For centuries, people have searched for the essence of the self, the pure core beneath the noise. But every time they peel back a layer, another mask is found, and beneath that, another. The philosopher David Hume once said that when he looked inward, he found no self, only a bundle of perceptions, flashes of thought, fragments of feeling, a storm of impressions passing by. There was no captain steering the ship, just the waves. That idea rattled people then, and it still does, because it means the self might be an illusion. Not a solid entity, but a story told in the moment, a moment that never stops changing. Modern neuroscience seems to agree. Studies show that the brain doesn't operate like a command center. There is no single region where the self lives. Different parts light up for different tasks. Memory here, emotion there, planning somewhere else. The feeling of being someone is stitched together, second by second, and it can unravel quickly. Trauma, illness, even sleep deprivation can alter personality, make someone unrecognizable to those they love. So if the self is fragile and the nature is fluid, what anchors a human at all? The answer increasingly seems to be narrative. People are not just bodies, they are stories, told to themselves, told to others. Stories that explain what happened, what it meant, and who they are because of it. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, believed that meaning, not pleasure, not power, was the deepest human need. In the camps, he saw that those who could not find meaning in suffering would often collapse into despair. But those who could, even in a sentence, even in a memory, had a better chance of survival. Frankl said, "Those who have a why to live can bear almost any how." This search for meaning isn't weakness, it's structure. It's what holds the fragments together. But stories are not neutral. They can lift or deceive. A person who believes they are a victim will act like one. A person who believes they're chosen may become cruel. The story becomes the self, and the self becomes the behavior. This is why myths are so powerful, not because they are literally true, but because they provide a pattern, a mirror, a map, the hero, the outcast, the martyr, the monster. People slip into these roles unconsciously, sometimes never realizing it, and often the stories aren't even theirs. They're inherited from culture, from childhood, from religion. A boy grows up told he must never cry, so he becomes a man who confuses numbness for strength. A girl is praised only when quiet, so she becomes a woman who apologizes for existing. These are not choices, they are scripts, and unless rewritten, they run the show. But rewriting is hard, because stories don't live in words alone. They live in the nervous system, in the muscles, in the breath. A soldier may leave the battlefield, but if his body still flinches at fireworks, the war has not ended. A child may grow up and move out, but if her stomach tightens every time someone raises their voice, the past is still speaking. This is the ghost in the machine. The body remembers what the mind forgets. Freud called it repression. Bessel van der Kolk calls it trauma. Nietzsche called it eternal recurrence. Whatever name is given, the fact remains. What is not healed becomes repeated. And repetition is everywhere. In relationships, in politics, in history. A population mistreated becomes a population that mistreats. A child of a narcissist becomes drawn to narcissists. The abused becomes the abuser. Not always, but often enough to be a law. Human nature doesn't just evolve, it loops, it echoes, it spirals, unless interrupted. But interruption requires awareness, and awareness requires pain. To see the loop is to step outside it. but to step outside is to admit it exists, and many would rather suffer than see, because seeing means changing, and change is terrifying, even good change, even freedom. This is why people sabotage themselves, why they stay in dead-end jobs, in toxic relationships, in ideologies that hurt them. Because familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar possibility. It's not stupidity, it's survival. The brain doesn't want happiness, it wants predictability, and predictability lives in pattern, even if the pattern is killing you. This is the dark edge of human nature, not the capacity for cruelty, but the capacity for comfort with it. A slow, quiet surrender, a sigh, a shrug, a story told one more time because telling it hurts less than changing it. But the most dangerous patterns are the ones reinforced by reward. Evolution has no ethics. It selects for what survives, not what is good. This is why traits like manipulation, tribalism, and deception persist, because they work. The liar often thrives, the charismatic sociopath climbs, the ruthless win wars. And so these traits spread, not through teaching, but through results. A child watches who gets the most attention, the most success, the most control, and they learn, not by what is said, but by what is rewarded. This is how toxic systems reproduce themselves, not with force, with incentives, with praise, with silence. This is also why change is so difficult. It requires not just willpower, but a shift in structure, a new pattern, a new reward system. And someone has to start it. Someone has to say no. Someone has to lose. First. Because the first to break the pattern is often the one who suffers most. The whistleblower, the rebel, the black sheep. But over time, this pain plants something. A seed, a new loop, a new story. And maybe that is what it means to be human. Not to escape nature, but to transform it, to use memory as medicine, to let the shadow speak without letting it lead, to know the beast, name the beast, and train it, slowly, with care. Human nature is not a sentence, it's a question, an open one, not easily answered, and maybe never fully. But maybe that's the point, to keep asking, to keep watching, to never assume the story is final. Because even the darkest loops can, in time, be rewritten, and what was once instinct can become choice. And if choice is possible, then what defines its boundary? Is it desire? Is it knowledge? Or is it something more primitive, something hidden beneath reason, masked by the illusion of autonomy? The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer didn't believe in freedom the way most do. He wrote that a man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. That sounds like a riddle, but it is not. It's a trap. It means that even when a person makes a decision, the source of that decision is not free. It is shaped by wants he did not choose, fears he did not invite, and needs he cannot fully understand. The will is not a clean slate. It is the sum of biology, memory, trauma, hunger, and chance. People are proud of their choices, but how many of them are truly their own? The desire to impress, the fear of being alone, the comfort of routine. These shape behavior far more than logic ever has, and yet people believe they are rational. This belief is so strong that it creates an entire architecture of justification. A person acts and then explains, not the other way around. Reason, in most cases, is not the cause of action. It is the lawyer hired afterward to defend the impulse. Neuroscience has tested this. In experiments, brain activity predicting a person's choice often appears seconds before they consciously decide. By the time someone feels they've made a choice, the choice has already begun. This doesn't mean there is no agency. It means agency is slower, more tangled, more mysterious than it feels. But even if free will is limited, something else remains: responsibility. Because the moment a person becomes aware of their patterns, of their inherited scripts, their unconscious loops, they face a new fork in the path. They can deny or they can shape. They may not choose their first impulse, but they can choose their response to it. And that sliver of choice, however small, is where character lives. The Stoics knew this. Marcus Aurelius wrote that everything external is beyond control, but the inner citadel, the fortress of one's own reasoned judgment, is sovereign. Life will offer chaos, insult, loss, pain. But how one meets it, that is the test, not of morality, of strength. Because the real battlefield is not the world, it is the inner storm. Nietzsche would have disagreed with the Stoics' calm detachment. He believed suffering was not something to endure, but something to embrace. To be wounded is to be deepened. To struggle is to become. He spoke of amor fati, the love of one's fate, not just acceptance, but reverence, a willingness to say yes to all that has shaped a person, even the terrible, especially the terrible. Because to reject suffering is to reject the self that emerged from it. This is not masochism, it is transformation. It is taking what breaks and making it sacred. But few do this. Most try to escape pain, not integrate it. They seek numbness, distraction, validation, and society profits from this. Every advertisement is a whisper. You are not enough, but you could be. Just buy this, just follow them, just change this one thing. In a world that sells insecurity, self-rejection becomes the business model, and the human animal, once wild and self-creating, becomes a consumer. Not of goods, of identity, of meaning, of worth, packaged, marketed, sold, and with each purchase, the mirror cracks further, because the more a self is constructed from the outside in, the less stable it becomes. A person praised for beauty fears aging. A person praised for achievement fears failure. A person defined by others fears silence. This is the quiet anxiety of the modern age. Not that people don't know who they are, but that they only know who they are in the eyes of others. And those eyes are always shifting. The philosopher Charles Cooley called this the looking glass self. The idea that identity is not internal, but relational. A reflection of how one imagines others see them. Not even how they actually see, just how one imagines it. Which means a person can be imprisoned by mirrors that don't even exist. Trapped in a house of reflections, trying to perform a self that will finally feel whole, but it never does, because the mirror always requires an audience. And peace, true peace, cannot exist where performance lives. This is why solitude is so feared, not because it is lonely, but because in solitude the performance ends, and what's left behind might be unfamiliar, might even be empty. But emptiness is not failure. It is potential. It is the space in which the true self, raw, unfinished, unpolished, can be met, not constructed, discovered. This is the paradox. To find oneself, one must lose the version created for others. To live fully, one must die symbolically, again and again. Every identity clung to becomes a coffin, every label a mask, even good ones, especially those, because anything used to escape the terror of being nothing becomes its own prison. The philosopher Alan Watts said, "Trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth. The self cannot be pinned down because it is not a thing. It is a process, a verb, not a noun." This is why rites of passage exist in traditional cultures, not just to mark time, but to destroy and rebuild, to strip identity to the bone, so something real can emerge. The boy becomes a man, not when he shaves or drives or votes, but when the old self dies, when the mask is broken, when fear is faced alone. The modern world has lost most of these rights, and in their place, confusion, adrift, a longing without direction. People ache for transformation, but no longer know how to cross the threshold. So they seek simulations, intense experiences, psychedelics, crises, breakdowns, because something in them knows the self they carry is too small for the life they feel, and something must be shed, something must burn. This is not mystical, It is psychological. Evolution wired humans to adapt, but adaptation requires rupture, and rupture feels like death, which is why most avoid it. But those who don't, those who enter the fire, often return with something the world cannot give. A sense of quiet, not perfection, not clarity, just stillness. A knowing not of who they are, but of how to be. This cannot be taught, only found, and only by walking through the door that fear guards most. The door marked unknown. And what waits on the other side of that unknown is not always clarity. Sometimes it's quiet. A kind of stillness that feels strange at first, like walking into a room where a loud machine has just stopped. The noise is gone, but the ears still ring. This is what it feels like when a person stops chasing. Not because they've arrived, but because they realize there was nothing to catch. The philosopher Lao Tzu hinted at this in the Tao Te Ching, whispering through verses that the highest virtue is not effort, but surrender. That the Tao, the way, is not something to be conquered or understood, but flowed with. The harder one grasps, the more it slips. The more one lets go, the more it reveals. This sounds backwards to the modern mind, which is trained for conquest, for clarity, for success. But clarity is not always wisdom, and success is not always peace. Often what the world calls progress is just acceleration, and what it calls strength is just tension. Look at how people live, busy, stressed, caffeinated, connected to everything but themselves. Constant motion, constant noise, a race with no finish line. But beneath it all is a quiet truth. Stillness is not emptiness. It is the foundation of depth. In psychology, there is something called the default mode network, an area of the brain that activates when the mind is not focused on a task. It is the network of daydreams, memories, self-reflection, and it only lights up in stillness. Not when distracted, not when scrolling, not when solving, but when sitting, breathing, being. This is where integration happens, where insight blooms, where the fragments of thought begin to form a pattern. But most people never reach it. Not because they can't, because they won't stop, because silence feels like failure in a world that rewards noise. And yet, those who touch stillness, truly touch it, often find something they didn't know they were missing. A feeling not of excitement, but of depth, not of being right, but of being real. The philosopher Blaise Pascal once said that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. This was not an exaggeration, it was a warning, because stillness forces confrontation with longing, with fear, with the stories one has outgrown but still clings to. In stillness, the masks melt, and the child within, the one buried beneath the roles, the titles, the achievements, begins to stir. Not to be healed, not to be fixed, just to be heard. This is not therapy, this is listening. And listening, truly listening, is perhaps the rarest act in the modern world. Most conversations are not dialogues, they are duels, each person waiting to speak, each person seeking to win. But to truly listen to the self, to another, to the quiet movements of nature, is to soften, to surrender the need to control. And in that surrender, something sacred begins to take form. This is where meaning lives, not in grand answers, but in attention, in presence, in the space between breaths. The ancient Japanese concept of ma describes this beautifully. It is the silence between notes in music, the pause between words in poetry, the emptiness that makes the structure visible. Without ma, there is no beauty, no rhythm, no life. But the modern mind fears emptiness. It fills it with noise, with content, with stimulation. And in doing so, it loses the capacity to feel wonder. Wonder is not a reaction, it is a state, a way of being. And it begins when the mind stops labeling, stops grasping, stops assuming it already knows. A tree is not a tree, it is a miracle of form and function and history. A dance of roots and water and sun, a cathedral made of cellulose. But to see this, one must forget the label. One must return to seeing as if for the first time. This is what children do. Before they are taught names, they see essence. Before they are taught to categorize, they explore. This is not ignorance, it is openness. And it is the doorway to something rare, reverence. Reverence is not worship, it is awareness, a kind of holy attentiveness, to sit with a falling leaf, to hear the texture of wind, to look into a face and see not just features, but stories, wounds, echoes. This is not sentimental, it is survival, because without reverence, life becomes utility. People become tools, nature becomes resource, and the soul begins to starve. Philosophers like Martin Buber spoke of this with piercing clarity. He distinguished between two ways of relating, I-it and I-thou. In the I-it relationship, the other is object, used, measured, controlled. In the I-thou, the other is subject, met, felt seen. And in that meeting, something larger arises. A spark, a bridge, a glimpse of the sacred, not in the sky, but in the moment. Most live in I-it, not by cruelty, by habit, but every once in a while, someone slips into I-thou, with a lover, with a sunset, with music, and something inside them expands. They forget themselves, and in that forgetting, they become more whole. This is the mystery of being human. That to lose the self is sometimes the only way to find it, not by erasing, but by dissolving, into connection, into presence, into being, and perhaps in the end, human nature is not something to fix or conquer. Perhaps it is something to remember, not as a formula, but as a rhythm, a return, a breath. And yet what is remembered can also be rewritten, not by erasing the past, but by re-seeing it, re-understanding it, letting it sit in new light. The mind is not a recorder, it is a painter, and memories are not files in a cabinet, but living brushstrokes, constantly being altered by how they are recalled. This is both beautiful and dangerous. Beautiful, because it means healing is possible. Dangerous, because it means distortion is inevitable. A child may remember a moment of fear as abandonment, even if the parent was only distracted. A teenager may remember a mistake as a defining failure, even if it was just a moment. And those memories become foundations, not because they're true, but because they're believed. The psychologist Elizabeth Loftus showed how easy it is to implant false memories. Through simple suggestion, people recalled things that never happened, not just faintly, but vividly. Details, emotions, certainty. This should unsettle anyone who clings to the idea of a solid past, because if memory is that malleable, then identity must be too. After all, who are you without your story? And if the story can shift, then what remains? The philosopher Nietzsche spoke of this when he wrote that life is not about discovering who you are, but about creating who you are. A terrifying freedom, because it removes excuses. If one is not merely the product of the past, then they are the architect of the future. But architecture requires vision, and vision requires space, and space is rare. Most lives are crowded, not just with noise, but with assumptions. Assumptions about what is possible, about what is deserved, about what is real. These are inherited, often unconsciously, from parents, peers, culture. A person told they are not creative stops trying. A person told they are too sensitive hardens. A person told they must always win forgets how to rest. These aren't decisions, they're adaptations. But every adaptation is a trade. Gain something, lose something. Become someone, forget someone else. And eventually a person wakes up in a skin that feels too tight. They call it anxiety. They call it burnout. But really, it's the soul trying to breathe. And this is why disruption, though painful, is sometimes necessary. Not just to escape a bad situation, but to remember who one was before the masks, before the edits, before the roles hardened into identity. Rousseau believed that man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. chains of expectation, chains of comparison, chains of performance. But the harshest chains are the ones wrapped in praise. Be the good child, be the achiever, be the helper. And slowly, silently, the self becomes a role, a puppet, a mirror, until the strings fray and the performance cracks and something primal begins to stir. Not rebellion, not destruction, just the question, what if there's more? Not more achievement, not more validation, just more being. This is the soft revolution, the quiet kind, the one that doesn't scream in the streets, but shifts the course of a single life. It begins not with action, but with pause, with asking, whose voice is this in my head? Whose expectations am I living out? What would remain if I stopped trying to be impressive? These questions are not comfortable, but they are kind because they make room. And in that room, something ancient can return. Not a new identity, not a better version, just the simple, animal presence of being alive. The breath, the heartbeat, the noticing. This is not passive, it is radical. In a world built on doing, presence is rebellion. And yet, presence alone is not enough. Awareness must become action, or it dissolves into fantasy. The gap between knowing and doing is wide and full of shadows. Fear, habit, doubt. These are the guardians of the old self. They whisper, don't change. It's safer here. Even if here is miserable, at least it is known. And so people hesitate. They gather knowledge. They wait for certainty. But certainty never comes. Because life is not a problem to be solved. It is a river to be entered. And the only way to know the water is to step in. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote that life can only be understood backward, but it must be lived forward. This is not a riddle. It is a map. It means the meaning comes after. The clarity arrives in hindsight. The purpose reveals itself in the wake. So waiting for perfect clarity before acting is like waiting for a map of a dream. It doesn't exist, and it never will. Which is why courage is not the absence of fear. It is movement with fear. It is the step taken not because of certainty, but in spite of uncertainty. And that step, however small, reshapes the path. Because action is the language the subconscious understands. Words may inspire, but it is action that rewrites the nervous system, that teaches the body a new rhythm, that plants a new memory, and with enough repetition, a new self emerges. Not constructed, but revealed. Like a statue hidden in stone, carved not by force, but by removal. What is removed? The lies, the noise, the assumptions. What remains? The real, the raw, the tender, the dangerous. Not perfect, not polished, just true. And maybe that is enough. Maybe that is the point. Not to arrive, but to return. Again and again. To what matters, to what is felt, to what cannot be named but must be lived. And so the return begins, not with a bang, not with a ceremony, but with a whisper, a noticing, a shift so subtle it almost goes unmarked. A glance held a moment longer, a breath taken fully, a decision made from calm instead of fear. This is how the unravelling slows, how the spiral starts to turn upward. But there is no climax, no grand moment of arrival. That is the hardest truth for many to accept, that awakening is not an event but a practice, a returning, again and again to presence, again and again to the body, again and again to the question, what is true right now? Because truth is not static, it moves like the wind. And to live in truth is not to have answers, but to stay in relationship with the unknown. This is why real freedom feels so strange, because it does not come with a map. It comes with space, and space is terrifying to those who have only known cages. The cage of should, the cage of always, the cage of this is who I am. But identity is not a cage unless clung to. It is a tool, a vehicle, and like all tools, it can be set down when no longer needed. This is what Carl Jung meant when he said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not who you think you should be, not who others expect you to be, but the living expression of your nature, your wounds, your gifts, your contradictions. Jung did not believe in perfection. He believed in wholeness, and wholeness requires shadow. The parts denied, the desires rejected, the truths buried because they didn't fit the story. These do not go away, they wait, in dreams, in symptoms, in projection, until one is ready to turn and face them. And when that happens, when the rejected parts are welcomed, even tentatively, there is a soft click, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. Not because the picture is complete, but because something lost has been found. Something forgotten has been remembered. This is the path of integration. It is not linear, it is not easy, but it is real. And it is rare because it requires humility to admit that the monster under the bed is not just imaginary, that the critic in the mind is not always wrong, that the things most feared might contain the exact medicine most needed. This is why some people break down before they break through. The old system must collapse, the ego must crack, the mask must fall. Only then can something new take root. And even then, growth is slow, organic, messy, like a forest regrowing after fire. Scorched earth, then green shoots, then more fire, then more growth. This is not failure. This is the rhythm of becoming. And yet, modern life has little patience for rhythm. It wants results, it wants guarantees. But life doesn't deal in guarantees, it deals in invitations. And every moment is one. An invitation to notice, to feel, to respond differently. Not better, just differently. Because different opens the door. Better is just another cage, a more polished mask, a subtler performance. But different, that is alive. That breathes, that moves. And so the question becomes, what would happen if I chose differently right now? Not tomorrow? Not after I've healed? Not once, I'm sure. But now, in this breath, in this conversation, in this choice. This is how reality bends, not with force, with attention, with repetition, with kindness. And slowly, the brain rewires, the body softens, the patterns loosen, the self expands, not into someone new, but into someone real. And that realness is not for show. It may not be impressive, it may not be beautiful, but it will be true. And truth, even whispered, even flawed, even trembling, is magnetic. It draws the right people, it repels the wrong ones, it reorganizes reality without effort. Because reality responds to congruence, to integrity, to someone who no longer pretends. And this is perhaps the most liberating truth of all. Nothing has to be added. Nothing has to be fixed, only revealed, only remembered, only allowed. And what is allowed heals. Maybe not fully, maybe not quickly, but enough. Enough to try again, enough to soften, enough to sleep without dread. And maybe that's all anyone really wants, not to be perfect, not to be extraordinary, but to be allowed, to be seen without armor, to be met without masks, to belong, not because of who they pretend to be, but because of who they already are. And that belonging starts inside. It starts with how one meets themselves, in the dark, in the quiet, in the truth no one else hears. That is the sacred space, not the stage, not the spotlight, but the silence after the show, when the mask is off and the mirror is honest. That is where freedom waits, not flashy, not loud, just steady, just true. And in that mirror's silence, what emerges is not a new self, but an old one, older than memory, older than name. The self before domestication, before performance, the one that felt the world directly, with no buffer of belief. Before a child learns what is appropriate, they express fully. They scream when angry. They dance when joyful. They cry without shame. But over time, emotion becomes managed. Behavior becomes curated. And the original signal is lost beneath layers of adjustment. Adaptation is intelligent. It keeps a child safe. It secures love. But what begins as survival can become a a grown person still acting out the same strategies they learned at 5. Don't be too loud, don't ask for too much, don't show weakness. And so they build a life around avoidance, not because they're broken, but because the fear once served a purpose. This is what Freud meant when he spoke of the unconscious, not as a mysterious otherworld, but as the storage unit for all that has been repressed, all the feelings pushed aside because they were inconvenient, or dangerous, or just too much. These repressed parts do not vanish. They become symptoms, tension, irritability, addiction, perfectionism, patterns repeated again and again, not because of fate, but because of unfinished business. Freud said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And so many people do. They call it bad luck. They call it karma. They call it just how I am. But beneath it all is something simpler, a memory that was never felt fully, a truth that was never voiced, a need that was never met. And to heal is not to go backward. It is to go downward, into the body, into the wound, into the place where the timeline cracked and the child froze. Not to rescue, not to relive, but to witness, to finally be present for the pain that had to be ignored. And in that presence, something thaws, not quickly, not dramatically, but surely, like ice softening under spring sun. The nervous system begins to trust again. The body starts to feel like home, and the world, once hostile, becomes a little safer. Not because it changed, but because perception did. This is not magic. This is biology. The body remembers what the mind forgets. And when the body is listened to, it responds. It doesn't need perfect words, just attention, just breath, just permission. And from there, new possibilities open, not just emotionally, behaviorally. A person who once avoided conflict starts speaking up. A person who once overgave begins to say no. A person who once shrank begins to take up space. These shifts seem small from the outside, but inside they are revolutions, because every new behavior is a betrayal of an old rule, and that betrayal is holy. It is how the inner rebellion begins, not against others, against the lie that one must be small to be loved, that one must be good to be safe, that one must be silent to be accepted. These lies served once, but they don't anymore, and releasing them is not selfish, it is sacred. It is how the self expands to match the soul. And the soul, whatever that word means, does not want perfection, it wants participation, aliveness, truth. It doesn't care if the truth is messy. It doesn't care if the truth is inconvenient. It just wants to be lived. And when it is, something shifts. People begin to feel it, not consciously, not always with words, but in the eyes, in the tone, in the energy. Something real has arrived. And it cannot be faked, it cannot be manufactured, it can only be uncovered. This is why some people feel magnetic without saying much, why some faces seem to carry stories even in silence, because they have gone into the fire and come back with ashes. Not trophies, not affirmations, just a knowing, a weight, a softness, a grounded presence that says, I have met myself in the dark, and I did not look away, and in that not looking away they became trustworthy. Not because they are always kind, not because they are always right, but because they are real, and realness in a world of masks is medicine. Not flashy, not viral, just essential, like water, like rest, like quiet. And so the journey continues, not toward improvement, but toward truth. Not to become someone else, but to become oneself more and more deeply. This is the task. This is the invitation. Not to transcend human nature, but to remember it, to honour it, to live it fully in all its mess and mystery. And so it is not transcendence that completes the arc of a life, but immersion. Not escape from the animal, but reconciliation with it. The great thinkers understood this, though they expressed it differently. Freud with his language of instincts, Nietzsche with his call to embrace the Dionysian, Jung with his invitation to make peace with the shadow. They all pointed toward the same reality, that beneath the polished surface of civilization pulses something older, something wild, something essential. And this is what frightens people most. Not the unknown, but the known that has been hidden. The rage they suppress, the longing they deny, the chaos they control with routines, roles, rituals. But chaos is not the enemy, it is the source. Order may build cities, but chaos births them. Order writes laws, but chaos writes songs. And the soul does not long to be organized, it longs to be whole. And wholeness includes the dark, includes the shame, includes the hunger. Not because these things are good, but because they are real. And what is real, when welcomed, transforms. This is the alchemy of attention. It does not fix, it witnesses. And in witnessing, it softens the edges. The monster becomes a wound. The addiction becomes a strategy. The cruelty becomes a cry. And suddenly, the things once hated become understandable, not acceptable, not excusable, but part of the human story, part of the strange, beautiful struggle of being both flesh and spirit. To wake up in a body that wants and a mind that judges, to crave safety and thrill at risk, to hurt others in the name of love, to seek truth and flee from it at the same time. This is not a flaw in the design, it is the design. Evolution did not sculpt us for peace, it sculpted us for survival. And survival is messy. It favours quick judgments, strong emotions, in-group loyalty, out-group suspicion. These were not moral choices, they were adaptations. Useful once, dangerous now, because the world has changed faster than biology. And so people walk around with Paleolithic wiring in a digital landscape, stimulated but unfulfilled, connected but lonely, free but anxious, and the old instincts, without a proper outlet, turn inward. The enemy is no longer the lion, it is the self. The inner critic becomes the predator, the body becomes the battleground, and the person becomes split between who they are and who they think they should be. This split is the root of so much suffering. Not pain itself, but resistance to pain. Not fear itself, but shame about fear. Not sadness, but the belief that sadness is weakness. And so healing begins not with doing, but with undoing, with questioning the assumptions, with asking, who told me I had to be perfect? Who decided that my worth is measured in productivity? Who benefits from my self-doubt? These questions are not rebellious, they are necessary, because the systems that shape belief are not neutral. They have agendas, some subtle, some obvious, all powerful, and to begin to see them, to trace their roots, to notice their fingerprints, is to begin to wake up. Not just politically, existentially, because every system, no matter how advanced, cannot replace meaning. It can offer convenience, comfort, even identity, but it cannot give purpose. Purpose is not delivered, it is discovered, and often in strange places, in grief, in loss, in breakdowns that seemed like endings but turned out to be portals. Viktor Frankl knew this. After surviving the concentration camps, he wrote that those who found meaning in suffering were more likely to survive. Not because they were stronger, but because they had something to live for. Something beyond the immediate, something transcendent. Not in a spiritual sense necessarily, but in a human one. Something that reached beyond the self, beyond the moment. And this is perhaps the deepest paradox, that purpose is found not in asking what life owes, but in asking what one can give. Not in having the right conditions, but in choosing the right orientation. An internal stance, a posture of presence. And presence is not passive, it is participatory. It listens, it responds, it shapes, it risks, and in risking, it makes meaning. Not guaranteed meaning, not easy meaning, but authentic meaning. The kind that burns slowly, the kind that leaves a trace. And that trace is all any of us ever leave. Not legacies, not monuments, but ripples, a moment of honesty, a glance of compassion, a decision to stay when it would have been easier to leave. These are not dramatic, but they echo. They echo in hearts, in memories, in choices made years later because someone once made them first. And in that way, every life touches another, even when it feels invisible, even when it feels small. There is no such thing as a neutral presence, just as there is no such thing as an unimportant moment. Everything shapes, everything speaks, even silence, especially silence, because in silence the truth gets louder. Not the truth of facts, the truth of feeling, the truth of being. And being in the end is the only thing asked of us. Not being someone, just being fully, honestly, here. But being in its rawest form is not always gentle. Sometimes it aches, sometimes it burns. Sometimes it confronts a person with feelings they've spent years avoiding. Sadness that lingers like fog in the chest, rage that simmers under politeness, longing that stretches across decades of silence. And yet, it is this confrontation that purifies, not in the religious sense, in the existential one. To be purified is to be emptied of what is false, not all at once, slowly, with each truth spoken aloud, with each tear finally allowed to fall, with each no uttered after years of swallowing yes. This is the work, this is the path, and it is not glamorous. There are no medals for meeting oneself honestly, no applause for sitting with pain instead of numbing it, no viral posts about quietly choosing integrity, but the soul notices. The nervous system notices, the child within notices, and slowly the residue of past betrayals begins to lift, not disappear, but soften, the betrayal of self that came from choosing approval over truth, the betrayal of silence in moments when voice was needed, the betrayal of endurance when boundaries were screaming. These betrayals do not make someone weak, they make them human, and the healing of them does not require punishment, it requires presence. This is what most people miss. Healing is not about fixing the past, it's about no longer abandoning the present. When pain rises, stay. When fear whispers, listen. When joy sparks, trust it. These are the micro movements of wholeness, and they matter more than any philosophy, more than any theory, because philosophy, at its best, should serve life, not distance people from it. This is where Nietzsche's madness was actually clarity. He refused to let ideas exist apart from blood, apart from skin, apart from real life. He said, "There is more wisdom in your body than in your deepest philosophy." And he was right, because the body knows. It knows when it's safe, when it's lying, when it's alive. And yet, so many are taught to override it, to ignore exhaustion, to push through discomfort, to dismiss intuition, all in the name of productivity, or politeness, or perfection. But the cost of that disconnection is staggering. It shows up in anxiety with no clear cause, in autoimmune disorders that medicine can't explain, in relationships that look fine but feel empty. And at the center of it all is a body screaming to be heard. Not analysed, not pathologized, just heard, just felt, just held. Even for a moment, because that moment opens a door, and behind that door is a whole world of sensation, memory, wisdom that has been waiting patiently. It doesn't demand credentials, it doesn't need permission, it only needs space. And space is a radical offering, especially in a world obsessed with speed, with efficiency, with answers. But life is not a multiple choice test, it is a poem. And poems must be read slowly, with breath, with feeling, with respect for the parts that don't make immediate sense. This is what the philosophers forgot sometimes. In their search for clarity, they lost beauty. In their pursuit of truth, they lost mystery. But human nature is not a machine. It is a river, flowing, changing, carving its own shape through rock. And no two rivers look the same. So comparison is useless. So is judgment. What matters is presence, is listening, is allowing. And when that happens, when a person finally lets themselves be exactly where they are, not ahead, not behind, just here, something ancient stirs, a kind of homecoming, not to a place, to a self, to a rhythm, to a belonging that was never truly gone, only forgotten. It feels like relief, like recognition, like breath returning after years of holding it in. And in that breath, in that remembering, the mind starts to relax its grip. The endless analysis loosens. The what-ifs and should-haves and maybe-laters fall quiet. And what remains is simple. I am here. I am enough. I am allowed. This is not a mantra. It is not affirmation. It is truth. And truth, once felt in the bones, does not need defending. It just is, like the sky, like the sea, like the silence after grief. It holds everything, and in that holding, the human becomes whole again. Not fixed, not finished, just whole. But even in this wholeness, there is no final peace, no permanent arrival. The human experience is not a straight road. It spirals, it circles back. Old wounds return in new costumes. Lessons thought to be learned resurface in deeper layers. This is not regression, it is rhythm. The soul does not move like a train, it moves like a tide. And so healing does not mean never hurting again. It means no longer fearing the hurt, no longer making it mean that something is wrong. Sadness can visit without becoming identity. Anger can rise without destroying love. Fear can whisper without deciding fate. This is maturity, not emotional control, but emotional capacity. The ability to hold more, to hold contradiction, complexity, nuance, to hold the truth that sometimes people love deeply and still cause harm. That freedom and responsibility are twins, that the things most longed for often come with loss, and still, to choose life anyway. This is the quiet courage of those who live with eyes open. Not the loud bravery of heroes, the quiet bravery of humans who get out of bed despite despair, who apologize when pride protests, who tell the truth when lying would be easier, who try again after being broken, again and again. Like the Japanese art of kintsugi, they do not discard the shattered pieces. They gather them, gold in the cracks, story in the seams, and what emerges is not restoration to what was. It is transformation into something new, something that includes the break, honors the break, learns from the break, and because of that, becomes more whole than it ever was before. This is how evolution works, not by erasing the past, by integrating it. Nature does not waste, it reuses, it recycles, it composts even the most painful things into fuel for new growth. And so it is with people. The heartbreak becomes poetry, the mistake becomes wisdom, the silence becomes song, but only if one is willing to feel it, to stay with it, to let it work through the body, not just the mind. This is the key. The body is not a barrier to healing. It is the doorway, the storage unit of memory, the journal of every moment that ever mattered. And it does not lie. Even when words fail, it remembers. The stomach tightens at unspoken truths. The shoulders rise with years of unacknowledged burden. The jaw clenches with withheld anger. And so to heal is not to figure it all out. It is to feel it all through. To sit in the discomfort long enough for it to speak. And it will speak, not in language, in sensation, in image, in impulse. And slowly, the frozen places begin to thaw. The numbness begins to tingle. The dissociation begins to ground. And presence returns. Not because someone earned it, because they made space for it. And space, as simple as it sounds, is revolutionary. It is the opposite of trauma. Trauma compresses, contracts, collapses, space expands, breathes, opens. And in that opening, the soul can re-enter the body. Life can re-enter the moment. Joy can return, not as distraction, but as truth. And joy, when allowed, is just as sacred as sorrow. Just as honest, just as clarifying. It reminds that healing is not only about what hurts, it is also about what heals, what delights, what enlivens, the sunlight on skin, the sound of laughter, the stillness of dawn. These are not luxuries, they are nutrients, and without them, the soul starves, even in a healthy body. Because humans were not meant to survive, they were meant to live, to feel, to connect, to create, to belong. Not as a performance, as a birthright, and yet, in this modern world, that birthright must often be reclaimed. Because systems don't teach wholeness, they teach compliance, they teach fragmentation, they teach people to specialize, to categorize, to optimize, but the soul cannot be optimized, it can only be honored, and honoring it requires slowing down, listening in, trusting what emerges, even when it contradicts the plan, even when it challenges the identity. Because identity too is fluid, not false, but flexible, a river, not a statue. And when it is allowed to shift, to grow, to evolve, life becomes more honest, less certain, but more true. And truth, even when uncomfortable, liberates, slowly, quietly, like dawn creeping in under the door. Until one day, without noticing, the light is everywhere. Not blinding, not dramatic, just present, just steady. Like the truth that has always been waiting inside. And what is truth if not the slow unveiling of what has always been there, hidden not by some cruel force but by layers of fear, distraction, and survival? It is not that people lie to themselves maliciously. It is that the truth, when first glimpsed, often terrifies. To realize that a life has been built on pleasing others, that a career was chosen to win approval, not passion, that a relationship endures out of habit, not love. These recognitions do not arrive politely. They rupture, they ruin illusions, and illusions, however false, feel safe. They wrap the psyche like a familiar blanket, warm but suffocating. So waking up is not euphoric, it is disorienting, like stepping out of a dark room into sudden daylight. The eyes squint, the body resists, the old stories scream louder, desperate to reclaim their grip. And yet, there is no going back. Once seen, the truth remains, not as a demand, as a possibility. A door cracked open in the mind, a quiet question echoing in the soul. What if I lived differently? What if I told the truth, not just to others, but to myself? What if I stopped pretending to be who they want and became who I am? These are not casual musings, they are dangerous questions. They threaten comfort, they invite transformation, and transformation is rarely neat. It begins with unraveling, with shedding skin that no longer fits, with grieving identities that once protected, with losing relationships that depended on the mask. This is why so many retreat, not because they're weak, because the cost feels unbearable. To step into truth is to lose something, maybe everything. But what is gained cannot be measured. It is not a better version of the old self. It is a new kind of being, not superior, more honest, more rooted, less reactive, less afraid. The ancient philosophers understood this. Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living, but he also knew the examined life was often painful. He chose death over silence. He drank the hemlock, not as martyrdom, but as a final affirmation of his integrity. To him, integrity was life. Everything else was shadow. And today, though few face execution for their beliefs, many still feel punished for their authenticity. Families recoil, friends drift, institutions reject. Because authenticity threatens the status quo. It doesn't fit neatly. It asks questions. It sets boundaries. And boundaries are radical acts in systems built on obedience. But they are also acts of love. Because a person who honors their own boundaries teaches others to do the same. They become a lighthouse in the fog. Not perfect, not always clear, but anchored, trustworthy. And trust in this disoriented world is gold. Not trust in authorities, trust in presence, in people who show up without agenda, who listen without fixing, who speak without performing, who live without pretending. These people exist, they are rare, but when found, they change everything. Not by doing, by being, by reminding others, simply by existing, that another way is possible, that gentleness can be strong, that softness can be wise, that vulnerability can be power. This is not theory. It is the lived experience of those who have faced the fire and chosen to feel it, who have cried without shame, raged without destruction, loved without attachment, and still risen the next day, softer not because they broke, but because they allowed the breaking. They made space for it. They let the heart crack open, and through that crack, light entered. Pain entered too, but also depth, also truth, also the quiet music of a life no longer filtered through pretense. This is what it means to be fully human. Not to be perfect, to be present, not to avoid suffering, to metabolize it, not to achieve enlightenment, to embody aliveness. And aliveness at its core is not a mood, it is a capacity. The capacity to stay with joy without grasping, to stay with fear without fleeing, to stay with love without clinging, to stay with discomfort without numbing, and through this staying to become real, like the velveteen rabbit, like the child who, when asked what they want to be when they grow up, says quietly, myself. This is the return, not to innocence, to essence, and essence is not an aesthetic, it is not a brand, it is not a curated identity, it is the vibration of truth that cannot be faked, that cannot be replicated, that emerges only when all else falls away, and it is this essence, when lived, that turns ordinary moments into sacred ones. A look held a second longer, a touch that carries no demand, a word spoken from the centre, not the surface. These moments are not grand, but they ripple, they accumulate, they heal, slowly, silently, deeply. And sacredness, despite what many believe, does not require religion. It does not demand temples or rituals or robes. It arises in the ordinary, when the ordinary is met with reverence. When a conversation is more than words, when a meal is more than calories, when a walk is more than movement, sacredness begins with attention. And attention, in this age, is revolutionary, because everything competes for it. Notifications, advertisements, deadlines, distractions dressed as connection. But when attention returns to the body, to the breath, to the simple fact of aliveness, the world changes. Not because the world changed, but because the lens did. This is what the mystics meant, what the philosophers hinted at. That perception shapes experience, that how one sees is more important than what one sees. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, wrote that the soul becomes dyed with the colour of its thoughts. He knew that clarity was not about changing circumstances, but consciousness. That suffering often emerges not from events themselves, but from the stories told about them. That the mind, when unchecked, is its own tyrant. And yet, it can also be its own saviour, if trained, if softened, if brought into the present moment again and again until presence becomes the habit, not the exception. But this training is not discipline in the traditional sense. It is devotion, not rigid, gentle, not harsh, kind. It does not say, do better. It says, come closer, closer to the self, closer to the truth, closer to the heart beating behind the noise. And when this closeness becomes consistent, life begins to feel different, not easier, deeper, more resonant, more alive. Small moments become vivid. Laughter tastes richer. Silence feels full. Even pain carries wisdom. And this wisdom is not intellectual, it is embodied. It knows what cannot be explained. It recognizes what cannot be named. It whispers when the mind screams. And in its whispering, there is guidance, not direction, orientation. A quiet knowing that does not rely on logic, that does not need validation, that simply is. And learning to trust this knowing is perhaps the greatest challenge in a world that worships certainty. Because certainty is intoxicating. It offers safety, predictability, control, but it is also a cage. It leaves no room for wonder, for growth, for the mystery that breathes between every inhale and exhale. And mystery is not ignorance, it is the heartbeat of the universe, the recognition that not everything must be understood to be honoured. That some truths arrive not through thinking, but through living, through experiencing, through surrendering to the not knowing. And in this surrender, paradoxically, more is known. Because the mind relaxes, the body softens, the spirit expands. And in that expansion, truth reveals itself not as an idea, but as a feeling, a resonance, a yes in the bones. And this yes is not always convenient. It does not always align with plans. It may ask for endings, for risk, for letting go of what once seemed indispensable. But it also brings freedom. The kind of freedom that cannot be purchased, only lived, only claimed by those willing to face discomfort, willing to trade certainty for authenticity. And authenticity, in its rawest form, is power. Not power over others, power within, the kind that roots a person so deeply in themselves that no storm can uproot them, that no opinion can define them, that no fear can paralyze them. This is what it means to be sovereign, to belong to oneself, not in isolation, in connection. Because true sovereignty is not separation. It is interdependence without entanglement, love without possession, presence without performance. And this kind of presence changes relationships, not because others change, because the dynamic does. Projection dissolves, expectation softens, communication deepens, and space opens, space for each person to be fully themselves, without shame, without defense, without the need to earn love through sacrifice. Because love, real love, does not demand sacrifice. It invites truth, it invites growth, it invites the kind of intimacy that is not about merging, but about meeting. Two whole beings facing each other, naked not just in body, but in soul. This is rare, but it is possible, and it begins not with finding the right other, but with becoming the right self. The self that no longer betrays its needs, that no longer shrinks to be palatable, that no longer hustles for worth, that no longer fears being alone because it no longer feels lonely in its own presence. This self is not created, it is revealed, layer by layer, lie by lie, until what remains is essence, and essence is magnetic. Not in the performative sense, in the energetic one. It draws not attention, resonance, it attracts not fans, kindred spirits, and these spirits, when found, do not complete. They reflect, they mirror what has been remembered, they amplify what was already blooming. And together, in that reflection, something sacred happens, something rare, something worth protecting. Not with walls, with truth, with presence, with the willingness to remain open even when it hurts, even when the past trembles in the body, even when fear begs for escape. Because what is sacred must be chosen, again and again, not because it is fragile, because it is valuable. And what is valuable deserves attention, deserves devotion, deserves the kind of reverence that does not elevate but deepens, that does not idolize but honors, that sees not perfection but presence. And in that seeing, the sacred is not found in temples, it is found in eyes, in breath, in the simple, quiet miracle of being alive together for one brief, beautiful moment in time. There is something deeply unsettling about the way people chase happiness as if it were a destination, a glittering city on the horizon, always just one promotion, one relationship, one achievement away. But what if happiness, as it's sold, is a trap? What if the pursuit itself is the problem? Rousseau believed that civilization corrupted man, that the farther people strayed from nature, the more they buried their innate goodness beneath the demands of society. And what does society demand now? constant self-optimization, flawless productivity, smiling faces in curated photos, emotions repackaged as content, pain transformed into performance. People have become products, marketing their worth in likes, shares, and engagement metrics. Even rest is now monetized, branded as self-care, only if it fits within an aesthetic. What began as survival has metastasized into performance, and the soul, quiet, slow, and raw, suffocates beneath the noise. Freud once said that most people do not really want freedom, because freedom involves responsibility, and responsibility frightens people. So they seek substitutes, comfort over truth, familiarity over expansion, numbness over feeling. And this numbing has become a lifestyle. Screens offer stimulation without connection. Work provides structure without meaning. Relationships offer presence without intimacy. And so the hunger grows, not for more things, but for something real, something that does not flinch from the truth, something that sees through the facade and says, yes, this too is part of being human. The rage, the grief, the envy, the loneliness. These are not problems to fix, they are messages to hear. But listening is hard. Listening requires stillness, and stillness reveals what busyness conceals, that most people are running from themselves. Carl Jung said that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. They chase goals not because they want them, but because they fear what would emerge in their absence. They fill calendars to avoid silence. They fill relationships to avoid solitude. They fill every moment with distraction so they never have to hear the quiet voice inside asking, is this it? Is this all? And in that silence lives the real fear, not death but unlived life. A life spent climbing ladders propped against the wrong walls. A life spent pleasing others, only to be abandoned by the self. A life spent chasing belonging in places that require self-betrayal. And so the question becomes not how to be happy, but how to be real. How to face the mirror and stay. How to feel without fleeing. How to speak without shrinking. How to grieve what never was without bitterness. How to celebrate what is without grasping. These are not easy questions. They require excavation. They require softness. They require the courage to look at childhood wounds and admit, I learned to survive by silencing myself. I learned to earn love by performing. I learned to abandon my needs to keep the peace. And now I must unlearn it all. Not because it was wrong, because it is no longer necessary. This is where philosophy and psychology meet in the quiet bravery of becoming. Becoming not someone new, but someone true. Nietzsche spoke of becoming who one is. But who is that beneath the armor? Beneath the roles and labels and masks? It is not a brand. It is not a persona. It is not even a fixed identity. It is a presence, a rhythm, a frequency that hums through the body when the mind goes quiet. And to live from that place is not glamorous. It is sacred. It is slow. It is deeply human. It looks like saying no when the pattern is to say yes. It looks like crying without needing to explain. It looks like laughing without permission. It looks like walking away from what once felt like home because the cost of staying is too high. And yes, it often looks like loneliness, because not everyone will understand, not everyone will approve. But solitude is not the same as isolation. Solitude is communion with self. And in that communion, truth blooms, slowly, softly, in the moments between things, in the pauses, in the stillness that comes after the storm. And that truth, once felt, cannot be unfelt. It becomes a compass. It becomes a song. It becomes the quiet knowing that even in the dark, there is something inside that will not abandon, that will not betray, that will not forget the way home. And so maybe the question is not what is the meaning of life, but what is the meaning of this moment, this breath, this choice to stay awake, to stay honest, to stay soft in a world that profits from hardness. This is not rebellion, it is remembering. Remembering that human nature is not fixed, it is not beastly or noble, it is not light or dark, It is both, and the work is not to choose one over the other, but to hold both, to walk the tension, to make peace with the paradox, and in that tension, to become whole. And to become whole is not to become perfect. It is not to ascend above the mess. It is to sink into it, gently, deliberately, without resistance, to walk barefoot through the landscape of human experience and feel every texture, the mud of failure, the gravel of regret, the grass of joy, the still water of peace. It is to touch the sharp edges of memory and not flinch, to hold the trembling child within and say, I see you, I'm not leaving. This is not healing as a destination, this is integration as a practice. And it is slow, like rivers carving canyons, like trees breaking sidewalks, like hearts mending in the dark. It takes time, it takes presence, it takes the willingness to live without rushing, because to rush is to bypass, and what is bypassed returns, in shadows, in symptoms, in sadness without name. The philosopher Kierkegaard said anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, that when all illusions fall away and a person sees how many choices they have, it can feel like standing on a cliff with no railing, terrifying, liberating, the same moment. And yet that is where real life begins, not in certainty, in surrender, in the soft letting go of needing to control what was never meant to be controlled. Other people, outcomes, time. The self is not a project to fix, it is a mystery to witness. And witnessing requires attention. Not the kind shaped by productivity, the kind shaped by care, by devotion, by the quiet decision to remain. This is the essence of love, not the romance of craving, the presence of seeing. To love is to see clearly and still stay. And the first person who must be loved this way is the self. Not the curated self, the real one, the tired one, the confused one, the one who snapped today and didn't mean to, the one who's still haunted by choices made at 16, the one who doesn't always feel strong or wise or okay. That one, that's the one who needs love. And love is not indulgence, it is not soft lies, it is fierce truth wrapped in tenderness. It is the voice that says, I will not let you go numb again. I will not let you abandon yourself again. I will not let you shrink to fit where you have outgrown. And this voice, when trusted, becomes the guide, the inner elder, the soft fire in the chest that knows what to do next, even if the mind doubts. And the doing is rarely dramatic. It is the email not sent, the boundary held, the rest taken, the mirror met with softness. These are not small acts, they are revolutions, because the systems around us do not benefit from wholeness. They benefit from obedience, from insecurity, from performance. So to reclaim the self is to disrupt the pattern, to say, I choose aliveness over approval. I choose integrity over comfort. I choose presence over productivity. And this choice will cost something. It always does. Illusions, relationships, false peace. But what it offers in return is immeasurable. The ability to wake up without dread, to look in the mirror without flinching, to walk through the world without pretending, and that is worth everything. The psychologist Viktor Frankl, who survived the camps, said that everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. This choice is not always easy, but it is always possible, and within it lies power. Not the power to control the world, the power to meet the world as it is, to bring presence into pain, to bring compassion into conflict, to bring truth into silence. This is the quiet revolution, the internal one, the one that changes the outer world not through force, but through alignment, through being so deeply rooted in what is real that everything false falls away. And when enough people do this, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, courageously, the world changes, not through policy, through presence, through the way one person sits with another in grief and does not rush to fix, through the way someone says no, firmly but kindly, through the way truth is told, even when the voice trembles. These are the seeds, these are the moments that matter, and they begin here, in the silence between words, in the breath between thoughts, in the gentle sacred returning to what has always been waiting, the self, unadorned, unafraid, alive. And what does it mean to truly be alive in a world that numbs? To wake up not just with open eyes, but with an open heart, when everything around whispers to stay asleep. It means to resist the subtle death of routine, of predictability, of safe choices made in fear. It means to move through life with tenderness when cynicism is easier. It means to feel it all, the longing, the ache, the joy that rises in the throat like a song no one taught. And most of all, it means to remember. Remember that before the roles and the rules, before the identities and obligations, there was simply awareness. Not a name, not a title, just a presence that witnessed everything, without judgment, without agenda. The Buddhists call this the watcher. The Christian mystics called it the indwelling spirit. The Taoists simply called it Tao. Whatever name one uses, the experience is the same. A quiet center behind the noise, a stillness beneath the storm, a self that is not personal, yet holds all personal things. And when one begins to live from that place, life softens. Not because suffering disappears, because resistance does. Pain still visits, but it is held differently. It is no longer a verdict, no longer a punishment. It is a wave, not a weight. And like all waves, it passes. But this requires unlearning. It requires stepping out of inherited beliefs, out of collective narratives that equate worth with output, love with sacrifice, and strength with stoicism. These are not truths. They are adaptations. Clever ones, yes. Necessary at times, yes. But not final, not eternal. And they crumble when met with presence, when met with the softness that says, you do not need to earn rest. You do not need to apologize for existing. You do not need to explain your emotions to be allowed to feel them. This softness is not weakness, it is power. The kind of power that does not dominate, it liberates. It uncoils the tension in the shoulders. It loosens the jaw. It allows tears to fall without shame. And in those tears, often for reasons unknown, there is healing. Not dramatic, subtle, like thawing ice, like forgotten roots remembering how to drink. Like the body, long ignored, learning again how to trust. Trusting that one will not override its signals, that one will not betray its boundaries for acceptance, that one will not abandon it in pursuit of productivity. And when the body begins to trust, it becomes a guide. It speaks clearly. This feels safe. This does not. Stay here. Move on. Say no. Rest now. Speak up. And following this guidance does not lead to a perfect life. It leads to an aligned one where actions reflect truth, where choices reflect values, where relationships reflect reality, not fantasy. And yes, this kind of living will cost something. It always does. Masks, roles, familiar patterns, sometimes people. But what it gives is priceless. A self that is no longer divided. A self that no longer wakes with dread. A self that feels at home in its own skin. And from that home, love becomes something different. It is no longer a transaction. No longer a performance. It is a meeting. Of soul with soul. Of breath with breath. Of truth with truth. This is rare. Because most people do not meet. They project, they perform, they protect. But when the projections drop, when the performance ends, something luminous emerges. Real intimacy, real connection, real presence. And that more than anything is what the soul craves. To be seen, to be known, to be held, not despite the flaws, but with them. This is where healing happens. Not in isolation, in presence, in connection that does not flinch, in eyes that do not look away, in hands that do not let go when the mask falls off. And to offer this to another, one must first offer it to themselves. That is the work, that is the path, and it begins not with grand gestures, but with small choices, pausing before reacting, asking what one needs, saying no without explanation, feeling without numbing, speaking without rehearsing, living without performing. These are not spiritual acts in the way most imagine, but they are sacred, they are radical, they are the quiet revolution that begins inside and echoes outward, changing everything, not through force but through truth. And when truth becomes the compass, even suffering begins to shift. It no longer feels like a punishment, but a passage, not a defect in the system, but a necessary teacher. Suffering clarifies. It peels away the inessential. It exposes what no longer serves. It invites one into deeper relationship with reality, not as it should be, but as it is. And in that relationship, something ancient awakens. A remembering that life was never meant to be controlled, only danced with. The philosopher Alan Watts said, "Trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth, because the self is not an object, it is not a resume, it is not a story with a beginning, middle, and end. It is a process, a movement, a verb, and when people try to fix themselves as if they are broken furniture, they miss the point. They are not broken, they are becoming, unfolding, responding, healing, grieving, loving, cracking open, falling apart, mending, becoming again. And this cycle is not linear, it loops, it spirals, it returns with new depth, and that return is sacred. But society does not honour spirals, it honours progress, momentum, upward motion, and so those who move differently, who pause, who slow, who tend to inner seasons, are seen as failures. But what if stillness is not stagnation? What if the pause is where real change happens? A seed does not grow in motion, it germinates in the dark, in silence, in surrender, and human beings are no different. Their deepest transformations often occur not in action, but in allowing grief to wash through, allowing joy to be felt without fear, allowing fear to rise without shame, allowing truth to surface, even when inconvenient. And this kind of allowing demands presence, not the kind manufactured in wellness ads, the real kind, the messy kind, the kind that sits in discomfort without reaching for a distraction, the kind that whispers to the inner child, "I am here, I see you, I'm not leaving." This presence is the medicine most people seek in others, but it cannot be outsourced, it must be cultivated, grown like a garden, tended with care, protected from the weeds of self-judgment and comparison. Because comparison is the thief not only of joy, but of authenticity. It convinces people to mimic lives that are not theirs, to chase desires that are not organic, to shrink or inflate themselves based on external mirrors. And in doing so, they lose the thread of their own becoming. They become actors in scripts written by fear, not authors of their own unfolding, and so the work becomes subtle, internal. How does one return to the thread? How does one discern between internal truth and external programming? The answer is always the body. The body never lies. The mind can rationalize anything. It can explain away pain. It can justify dysfunction. But the body knows. The gut tightens, the heart sinks, the breath shortens. And these signals, though quiet, are precise. They are the compass. They are the map. They are the guide back to what is real. And learning to follow them is an act of rebellion in a world that teaches disconnection. From birth, people are taught to override their knowing, to eat when the clock says, to sleep when told, to smile when uncomfortable, to perform politeness over authenticity. And slowly, they forget the language of their own bodies. They forget how to hear the yes, how to trust the number, how to honour the maybe, and in that forgetting, they become strangers to themselves. But remembering is possible, and it begins with attention. noticing the small things. How does the chest feel in this room? How does the breath move in this conversation? What parts of the body go numb in certain dynamics? This noticing is not indulgent, it is intelligent. It is how one begins to gather data, not from intellect, but from lived experience. And over time, this data forms a pattern, a story, a truth. And that truth cannot be argued with, because it is felt. It is known in the bones. And from that knowing, boundaries become non-negotiable. Not as walls, but as membranes, as sacred containers for what is tender, what is real. And honouring them becomes not a fight, but a fact, a way of being. A quiet declaration that says, this is what I can hold. This is what I cannot. This is what I choose. This is what I release. And each choice, though invisible to the world, reclaims a piece of the self. And slowly, gently, the inner world begins to change. Not with fireworks, with steadiness, with peace, with a groundedness that does not need to be proven. This is the revolution, not outside, inside. And if the revolution begins inside, then it must be protected there too, not from others, but from the old voices still whispering inside the mind, the ones that sound like parents or teachers or ex-lovers or even the culture itself, repeating stories that no longer serve but still echo through the halls of thought like ghosts that haven't realized they're dead, saying things like, you're too much or not enough, or it's selfish to rest, or love must be earned, or failure defines worth. These voices are not truths, they are echoes, and echoes fade when met with silence, when not repeated, when not believed. And this is the great unlearning. Not the adding of new beliefs, but the shedding of false ones, layer by layer, like a snake molting its skin, like a tree dropping leaves in autumn. Not because it's dying, but because it's making space, because the old cannot hold the new, because evolution is not a comfort game. It's a shedding, a dying, a rebirth, and rebirth is never clean. It's messy, it's bloody, it's loud and quiet, and full of contradiction, and yet through it all, the soul knows, this is right, this is mine, this is the way home, and home is not a place. It is a state of being, a place where the body and the soul and the breath align, and nothing has to be different for safety to exist. And arriving there does not mean perfection, it means wholeness. It means even the broken parts are welcome at the table. It means every version of the self gets a seat, not just the healed ones. And this is how the war ends. Not by defeating the wounded parts, but by listening to them. Not by silencing the pain, but by understanding its language. Because pain is not just suffering, it is information. It is the body's way of saying something matters. Something needs tending. Something was crossed or lost or never held properly. And when pain is honoured instead of dismissed, it softens. It begins to reveal its gifts. It begins to alchemize into insight, into clarity, into power. Not the loud power of dominance, but the soft power of knowing, of being, of not needing to perform because the worth is already known. And this kind of power doesn't need to convince anyone. It simply moves differently. It walks into a room and brings peace instead of presence. It speaks and people listen not because it's loud, but because it's true. And truth resonates like a tuning fork in the chest of those ready to hear it. And this is what people forget in a world obsessed with volume. The real ones are often quiet, often soft, often mistaken for weak, until the storm comes and everyone leans on them. Because softness is not fragility. It is strength unshaken. It is the strength of water, of earth, of wind through trees. The kind that bends but never breaks, that holds without needing to grip, that loves without needing to possess. And to become this kind of strong, one must first let go of all the ways they've been told to be strong, the stoicism, the suppression, the silence, and instead lean into vulnerability, into honesty, into the trembling truth of being human. Because there is nothing more powerful than someone who is no longer hiding, who no longer needs masks to feel safe, who has made peace with their mess and no longer fears being seen. And in that kind of presence, others feel permission to do the same, to drop the act, to breathe deeper, to soften into themselves. And this is how healing spreads. Not by force, but by resonance. One nervous system calming another, one breath slowing the room, one truth rippling outward through quiet lives lived with fierce integrity. And when this happens enough times, a culture changes, not from the top down, but from the inside out, because systems are built on people, and people are built on beliefs. And when beliefs shift, behaviour shifts, and when behaviour shifts, the world begins to mirror back a new possibility, a new way, one rooted not in fear, but in presence, not in shame, but in compassion, not in domination, but in alignment. And this is not a utopia, it is a process, ongoing, imperfect, alive. And it begins here, in the small moment of choice. Do I abandon myself, or do I stay? Do I perform, or do I tell the truth? Do I collapse, or do I breathe? Do I run, or do I remain? And in that breath, that pause, that return, a new self is born. Not created, uncovered. And the uncovering is the gift, the peeling back of everything that is not truth until only what is real remains. And what is real is always enough, always whole, always worthy, always waiting, like a candle in a cave that never went out. Even when the walls grew cold and the nights long, it waited, and now it flickers again. Not with certainty, but with courage. Not with answers, but with presence. And that is more than enough to begin again. And maybe that's all healing really is, not fixing what's broken, but seeing what was always whole beneath the breaking, remembering that the cracks were never flaws, but entry points. Places where the light could seep in, places where feeling returned. Because numbness might feel safe, but it is a prison. And prisons built from self-protection don't stop the pain, they just isolate it. They seal it behind walls that grow thicker with every unshed tear, every withheld truth, every quiet resignation to suffering as the default mode of living. But suffering is not a requirement, it is a messenger, and its message is simple. Something is out of alignment. Something needs your presence, and when that presence arrives, even the heaviest grief begins to soften. Not disappear, soften, because grief doesn't need to be solved. It needs to be held. Like a child waking from a nightmare, flailing and afraid, needing arms, not answers, needing silence, not solutions, needing warmth more than words, and the self is no different. The old selves inside, the rejected ones, the ashamed ones, the scared and scrambling ones, they need that too, to be held in a kind of quiet attention, an unflinching gaze that says, I see you, and I am not turning away. And in that gaze, in that steady seeing, shame loses its grip, because shame cannot survive exposure. It feeds in the dark, thrives in secrecy, but when brought into the light of consciousness, it begins to evaporate. It begins to reveal the innocence beneath it. The unmet needs, the old wounds dressed up as defects, and those wounds, once understood, lose their sting. They become part of the story, not the whole of it, like burned pages in a book that is still being written. And maybe that's what wholeness really is. Not the absence of wounds, but the presence of compassion for every wound one carries. And that compassion changes everything. It changes how one speaks to themselves, how one sets boundaries, how one loves. Because love without compassion is performance, it is approval. Seeking, it is fragile, but love rooted in compassion is resilient. It doesn't flinch at pain, it doesn't flee at discomfort. It stays, it listens, it asks, how can I hold this with you instead of fix you? How can I make space instead of offer solutions? And that kind of love is rare, because it requires presence, and presence requires the death of ego, the willingness to be uncomfortable, to not know, to not win, to not control the narrative. And yet it is what we crave most, not perfection, presence, not answers, understanding, not invincibility, vulnerability. And when that is met, even once, it rewires something. It creates a memory that becomes a blueprint, a reminder that intimacy is possible, that not all touch is dangerous, that not all closeness hurts, and this memory becomes something the nervous system can return to, can regulate by like a lighthouse in the storm of human chaos. And it's this kind of anchor that allows growth to happen safely, not from pressure, but from permission, not from force, but from nourishment. Like a plant growing toward light without needing to be pushed, it simply grows because the environment supports it. And that's what people need too. Not fixing, but fertile ground. Not advice, but curiosity. Not correction, but connection. And most of all, they need to be allowed to be in process, to be messy, to contradict themselves, to outgrow beliefs and identities and relationships that once made sense but now suffocate. And in that allowing, transformation becomes not a destination, but a rhythm, a natural unfolding that doesn't need to be micromanaged. It just needs to be trusted. And trust is the hardest thing to reclaim once it's been broken, especially self-trust, because betrayal leaves echoes, and echoes become habits, and habits become identity, and soon the self believes it cannot be trusted with its own choices, and that belief is a cage. But even that cage can be opened, not by willpower, by evidence. Small choices honoured, small needs met, small truths spoken, and over time these small things become a chorus, a rhythm, a pulse that says, I am listening to myself again, and that listening becomes the soil of self-reclamation, the beginning of sovereignty. Not the kind of sovereignty that isolates, but the kind that roots, that grounds, that says I belong to myself first, and from that place all other belonging becomes a gift. Not a grasping, not a transaction. And this is the essence of power, not over others but over one's own presence. Not dominance but dignity, not control but coherence. And coherence is rare in a fragmented world, a world that profits from disconnection, that sells solutions to wounds it helped create. But the antidote is not to fight the world, it is to unplug from its games, to opt out of its illusions, to remember that the only real revolution is the one that begins within and radiates outward, like breath, like warmth, like a candle lighting another without losing its flame. And all of this, the healing, the remembering, the soft resistance to the machinery of performance, is not a task for the privileged few with time to spare. It is the quiet rebellion of anyone who refuses to be turned into a product, who refuses to live like a machine, who dares to believe that being is enough, that stillness is not laziness but wisdom, that rest is not indulgence but repair. And this belief does not come easily because it goes against every cultural script, every school bell, every job description that trains the body to move on command and the heart to wait its turn. But the body remembers something older than culture. The body remembers being wild, remembers trees instead of walls, rivers instead of clocks, rhythms instead of schedules. And when given the chance, the body will always return to this knowing, to this deeper intelligence that does not speak in words but in signals, in sensations, in cravings and contractions and goosebumps that whisper, this is right, this is wrong, this is love, this is not. And listening to that wisdom is the deepest act of fidelity to the self. It is saying, I trust you to lead me home, even when it means letting go of what is familiar, even when it means walking alone for a while, even when it means being misunderstood, because the path of authenticity is rarely the path of approval, and the world may not reward it, but the soul does. The soul rewards it with peace, not the peace of no problems, but the peace of no pretending, no performing, no betraying the self to be liked, and that peace is a quiet ecstasy, a subtle freedom, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but settles in the bones. And this is where real confidence lives, not in bravado or bravura, but in alignment, in knowing that the inner and outer self are no longer at war, and from that place of peace one begins to see the world differently, begins to see through the lies that were once believed, begins to notice how much of modern life is built on disconnection, how technology connects but doesn't nourish, how productivity replaces intimacy, how attention is monetized, how even self-improvement becomes a trap if it's just another form of self-rejection, wearing a prettier mask. And this noticing is painful at first because once seen it cannot be unseen, and grief comes. Grief for all the years spent asleep, all the masks worn too long, all the dreams traded for approval. But grief is not the end, it is the beginning. It is the soil in which new life grows. It is the necessary melting before rebirth. And this grief, if honoured, becomes grace. It becomes the doorway to compassion. Not just for the self, but for others, for everyone walking through life with secret wounds and silent battles, everyone trying to be okay in a world that teaches them to hide what hurts. And from this compassion, connection becomes possible again. Not surface-level connection, but the kind that doesn't flinch, the kind that sits in silence without trying to fix, that listens without agenda, that holds space without needing to rush toward comfort. Because comfort is not always what's needed. Sometimes what's needed is truth, raw and unvarnished, the kind of truth that cracks open the shell and lets the real self breathe. And breathing, finally breathing, is how the cycle breaks, how the trance ends, how the body becomes a home again instead of a battlefield. And from that home, everything changes. Not overnight, but inevitably. Because when one stops abandoning themselves, the world stops feeling like exile. And this belonging is not about fitting in. It is about being rooted in the now, in the breath, in the knowing that even here, even like this, one is already enough. And enoughness is the medicine that capitalism cannot sell, because it ends the hunger that fuels the machine. And so the machine will keep whispering that more is better, that worth must be earned, that rest must be justified. But every time one says no to that whisper, a crack appears in the armour, and through that crack the light comes in. Not the blinding light of answers, but the soft light of awareness, of presence, of the quiet knowing that to be alive is already a miracle, that nothing needs to be added to make it sacred, and that perhaps the only real work is to remember what was never lost, only covered, only silenced, only buried beneath the rubble of shoulds and musts and the long ache of wanting to be good enough. And so we return again, to this moment, to this breath, to this body, to this story that is not over and never was broken, only paused, waiting for the moment we chose to begin again.